Hello everyone, today we talk about Ottoman auxiliary cavalry, which could be rephrased in most of Ottoman light cavalry, right? And this is a very important topic, as a matter of fact, both because of the from a tactical point of view, looking at Ottoman armies and how they functioned effectively on the field, but also this opens a bit to much deeper questions about the not just the Ottoman military, but the Ottoman Empire in itself. So when we talk about the Ottoman army in this, by the way, we're going to talk essentially between in the early modern period, so roughly from the beginning of the 16th century to the mid 17th, right? And there are many changes also in here, so sometimes it's difficult. And I had some trouble even finding reliable information by certain standards. But that gives you the measure already of one important historical datum, that is how, let's say, blurred and mixed at the end of the day certain processes were, right? So when we talk about Ottoman warfare in the early modern age, that especially in the clash with Western Europe, basically, you see that the Ottoman army has a main, let's say, tactical advantage in light cavalry, right? The Ottomans were usually disadvantaged in the heavy infantry that the Westerners were developing. Pike and shot tactics. The Ottoman infantry never quite reached that level of steadiness and stubbornness on the field, for reasons that one day we'll explain. I made a video on the Janissaries, so that partly explains the point. There is an Ottoman history, I think, playlist, so if you're interested you can take a look at that. But every Ottoman force at this point was surrounded by vast clouds of irregular light horsemen, right? This is very, very important. Ottoman auxiliary cavalry made a deep impression in Europe at this point, because it was fast-moving. It was definitely far-ranging, ruthless, and it could appear from nowhere. This was the main thing of the Ottomans. That before the main army advanced, were pretty damn large armies. There were these swarms of light cavalrymen that, as we will see now, we can't even talk about Turkish cavalrymen, but there was a dramatic ethnic composition into this thing, including Christian cavalries in the account, that appeared, in fact, in every direction. Now, this tactical element, as you know, is fundamental, because most of military operations carried out during a campaign are really this ones of exploring, foraging, scouting, and aggressing the enemy supply lines. So the Ottomans were a bit of the masters in Europe. This thing, say that, what was the point of this? Why was this the case? Well, as you know, the Ottomans proper rise from Anatolia and this area that had been occupied by these pastoral societies coming from Central Europe since the High Middle Ages, actually, and that had retained, in fact, largely this semi-nomadic lifestyle. The horse archery was a bit the national identity of these peoples. Was the idea that that had to be this cavalryman that naturally, in these societies could be preferably like a bit of the equivalent of the Western knight. There was the idea that the heavier, the noblemen, etc., were the heavier guys, and the Ottoman army definitely had, especially within its irregulars, some pretty damn heavy cavalry. But the largest amount, the average cavalryman here, is light, and is mostly a horse archer, right? So this is a part of the story, in the sense that, from Anatolia the Ottomans start shaping their own empire, the conquest of Constantinople, etc. Actually, most of the Ottoman conquests started from Europe proper, because at one point, actually, the Ottomans own more of European lands than what they do in Asia. But there is also another element that is actually autochthonous to Europe, to the Balkans, to Eastern Europe, even to certain parts of Central Europe proper. that has maintained throughout the centuries, since ever, basically, since antiquity, this character of, in fact, also in here, of it's difficult maybe to call it semi-nomadic, but definitely there were certain communities around these areas that had remained largely, also characterized by this particular military styles, right? Especially considering the Ukrainian steppe, and then in part even within the Pannonian plain, there is this continuation of Asia into military culture, right? Of fast-moving horse archers that can hit here and there, and in fact, many of the enemies of the Ottomans that from the Christian European side that fell and that fought actually since the beginning with the Ottomans, because they were the most exposed to their frontier, were in fact famous because of their equestrian traditions. Think about the Hungarians, right? Hungarians throughout the Middle Ages had basically feudalized as a kingdom. They were pretty westernized in every fashion, but could still levy these large amounts of light cavalrymen coming from here and there. Kingdom of Hungary was really based, large, huge, and they had kept settling this semi-nomadic population coming from the east. Naturally, the Ottoman Empire invests also these other, actually Muslim-held regions like Crimea, this other regions of the black coastal regions of the Black Sea, facing Black Sea, that had been occupied, in fact, probably by Tartars, right? So think about the Khanate of the Golden Horde, or even the Crimean Khanate that now we'll see in a while. So populations that, in fact, had maintained largely this horse archery tradition and fought in that fashion. So in all this enormous area towards which basically the Ottoman Empire expands, largely the Ottoman Empire usually had 3 fronts opened at once. Part of the reason why it kind of crumbled also in the end, because that consumes resources. There's this myth that the Ottoman warfare kind of declined because of technological backwardness. Telling the truth, there is, the most advanced historiography today shows us that it's absolutely not the case. The Ottomans had a pretty damn sophisticated and effective military, and if anything, the problem was really, in fact, to pay it, like to support it and to make it work. So, but that's the history that starts mostly from the second half of the 17th century onwards, that we're not going to talk about today. But just for presenting a bit the idea that, in fact, at this point there weren't even these massive differences between certain populations within Europe and other surrounding regions, and that especially the Ottoman invasion, the Ottoman expansion, the conquests were actually a very let's say a field of hybridation, we can say, that is very important even for today's Western identity, because objectively our Western identity, I believe, in the narrower, let's say, modern sense of the term, is structured in opposition to the Ottoman Empire. Like, we define ourselves in the narrow sense of Westerners because of the memory of what the clash with this gigantic power that was next door really was. And naturally we have to think also at the geography in here, because aside from the peoples that inhabited the various lands in the Balkans, in Central Europe, etc., you have to think also at the idea of the frontier proper. I mean, the idea that there is not really a line within which, from one side there is the Muslims even, and the other the Christians. Everything was blended pretty heavily, especially obviously from the Ottoman side. We will see today, in fact, how it was plenty. I mean really plenty of Christians in Ottoman armies, right? But this, as always, is a way to produce civilization as in terms of spin-off, right? Wars are destructive, they're terrible, they destroy entire populations that get slaughtered and oppressed in the most horrifying ways. But at the same time, there is the ability the necessity, the evident necessity to cope with this and to find new solutions. And we will see that even the relations, maybe not today, but the relations between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire were sometimes much more shaded, and also this kind of dichotomic or bipolar approach is wrong. If there is a word you cannot use on Schwerpunkt, is things like geopolitical, symmetrical warfare, or asymmetrical warfare, because there is only asymmetrical warfare by definition, because otherwise it wouldn't be war. Or in fact, poles, like, bipolar system, and this is thing that will lead to bad journalism, not to military history, and maybe we'll explain it one day. So this Ottoman light cavalry that we're going to describe now gave the Ottomans this great advantage most of the times in reconnaissance and intelligence. All right. And there was a bit also of a kind of a universal type of equipment, because nearly all of this irregular troops would be kind of light horse archers with composite bows and scimitars. Although they carried also spears and naturally other side weapons that we'll see a bit better. So and the history here gets a bit complicated, because there were various typologies aside from the strictly ethnical components that we will see now, like the Wallachians or the Moldavians or the Arabians or the white ship Turks and all the stuff. There was a kind of a segmentation within the same Ottoman Empire that had its own irregulars, right? This is important to distinguish from the Sipai, that were properly the soldiers and the regulars in some ways. Also here, the thing is extremely blurred, because when you get to study what the origins of these troops were, you realize that it was kind of no homogeneity proper. Remember that the Ottoman Empire was not just a multi-ethnic empire, but it was it had a very strong centralized system by certain standards, because it was in large measure had largely inherited part of what the Byzantine administrative tradition was and all this stuff. There are striking analogies between, for example, the strategical problems of the Byzantines and the one of the Ottomans. But within the same Ottoman system, actually the various provinces of the empire were very, very different from each other, right? There was a great reliance of the Ottomans on this composite nature of their own empire, also in terms of, in fact, of drawing military resources, right? Because, money and resources are always the same thing, while combat styles evidently are not. So there was a striking heterogeneity in what an Ottoman army would look like on the field. And it's not that in the West it was that different, because actually here the rise of centralized, professional armies is something very slow. But at least in Western Europe, more or less, the people fought kind of in the same way, right? In here, the Ottomans could take troops from, in fact, literally from Russia to Sudan, and from Hungary to Iraq. So it's a big thing, and usually these empires, in fact, have a big deal of of spin-off, of, let's say, of advantages also deriving from these combinations and this availability of troops, right? It's also a way to, at a governmental level, to balance all of these areas, so that, by fueling competition by the various provinces, you can also keep the whole system in place. Always remember that the Ottoman Empire is properly conceived as a universal empire, obviously by the Ottomans themselves. So it's a big deal overall, but we have made at this point several videos on Schwerpunkt already showing how the Ottomans are born as an empire proper, not much as a dynasty, but as an empire, as something much closer, like probably the closest thing in Islam to Western culture. Right, they were, even if you look at the geography of how the Ottomans developed, basically they were rising from Byzantine territories, right? From Byzantine held territories, they had a dramatic Western influence, right? And obviously from a Western perspective, we tend to say, oh no, they were something else because they were Ottomans and all, the Turks and all. But if you, for example, look at Ottoman the Ottoman military compared to the one of the Safavids or other Eastern powers, you realize that the Ottomans were dramatically and deeply westernized in a way it's almost unbelievable if you've never been acquainted with the idea. But it's really so, and that's also probably what gave really an edge in a certain measure to the Ottoman military to become the one that it was, right? And always remember that when you have these blocks like the Westerners were fighting against the Ottomans, some of them at least, there is this obviously deep hatred and all, those were the enemies, right? But there is an enormous respect from both sides, like a respect of the military capabilities, something that objectively crossing civilizations often happens. Like you can kill yourself on the battlefield, but in fact saying, I have this hell of enemies, right? And plus there was a lot of intersections of other kinds. So the most famous of these types of cavalries were definitely the Akincis, if I name it correctly. They were fundamentally scouts, often at least initially of Turkish origin, and there was this light cavalry force, as we've seen. The name in itself comes from Akin, the Turkish word Akin, that means raid or incursion into enemy territory, hence Akinci, so meaning the raiders, literally. And they appear to the Ottoman, in the chronicles for the Ottomans in as early as the second half of the 14th century. They were, as we were saying originally, Turkmen in origin. There were often this let's say based let's say numerically swarms of the so-called Gazis. So these warriors of the faith that were basically also in here we should tell a lot about the background of Anatolia proper, because Anatolia was a bit of a region of frontier, sometimes even of outcasts since the time of the medieval caliphate, where there was this great ferment, if you want, and of ideas of and widespread political instability, for which even the territory was fundamentally pastoral, as we've seen. So this kind of harsher semi-nomadic lifestyle intertwined this kind of vision of war all in one with a military lifestyle. By definition, right? These weren't sedentary populations, at least they were in part were sedentary, of course, but in great part these were still kind of, in fact, semi-nomads. Like they were raiding all the time, cattle, like the Far West, cattle warfare, raids, stuff like that. And obviously they weren't much of a, by themselves, of a very qualitative forces. Obviously they were great individual cavalrymen, but they weren't framed under, at least until the Ottoman Empire didn't develop properly the way it did, with a centralized military and all. They weren't framed in a power who could make a big deal with them. It was pretty easy throughout all the Near East and far beyond eastwards. All this enormous amount, constantly replenishable amount of this light archers. So light horse archers have this evident function of harassing the enemy constantly, especially when they're in large numbers, because that's at the end of the day what light horse archers are about, and then waiting for instead a heavier force to strike in combination with them. And in Ottoman times, however, this Akinci they undergo a change essentially, because they become framed within the direction of certain dynasties of local chieftains that they already did before, like the Uk Bey, for example, these frontier chiefs that the Ottomans start settling from Anatolia in other they had this base of this endless pool of these troops. They start settling it around the frontiers, this strategic frontier posts throughout, in this case, the Balkans, notably in Hungary, in Serbia, in Moldavia, in Wallachia, and Greece even, right? So these were troops that could be hired in different ways. They could be either volunteers or conscripted, but the point is that they were always readily available, and they had for what their tactical task was. You always had them. They were excellent. They did what they had to do, and the Ottoman the empire could rely on them all the time. Over time, so why this frontier function? Well, because obviously frontier warfare is mostly like this kind of raiding warfare, right? So you need light cavalry that is able to raid, to attack, to strike, to move fast. So to make the surprise effect, to raid, to pillage, and to therefore hit the enemy territory, forming kind of a larger frontier. This was a concept that in the Balkans was very, very old, right? The idea that fundamentally the line of the Danube constituted a frontier of some kind that was highly militarized in many ways, which means that it was always a border empire, like between Hungary and the Byzantine Empire, also other powers that risen, like the Bulgarians or the Serbians, etc. So areas are pretty damn tough grounds, by the way. Maybe not always well suited for cavalry combat, but let's say in certain areas of the middle and lower Danube, and definitely most of the Pannonian plains, definitely that's a pretty damn effective ground for the Akinci cavalry, right? As we were saying before, that it's as if that was a continuation of the steppes, environmentally speaking. So you have grazing fields, you have pastures, you can move easily with horses, and to make all these incursions and carry out this hit and run tactics, and so on. So these are cheap units as well. You don't have to invest a lot as an empire to maintain them. So you don't send the elite troop on the frontier. The elite troop stays in the core lands, the core regions of the empire, close to Constantinople, between Asia and Europe, and you preserve them. You stay. You have the true center of your power. And then when there is a military campaign, you send them, of course, with the whole army in this case in the north, or wherever, also in the other frontiers. And they're always surrounded instead by this larger amounts of lighter of throwaway of cheap troops, right? There is a change, however, that occurs over time. It always happens, especially when there is a sort of continuous warfare that protracts itself also during several generations. These were originally Anatolian Turkmens that are that in Anatolia are making have this kind of lifestyle, military lifestyle, their own traditions, their own local society. You bring them on the Danubian frontier, well, it's a bit different, right? It's not something that really, it's not the same thing. And over time, obviously, these people kind of abandon even partly the older traditions, like they mingle with other populations. They are framed within this larger imperial military, right? Always remember that Anatolia for a long time was still kind of a thorn in the flank, for not saying worse, say, to the Ottoman Empire proper. All right, the Ottomans conquered, as we were saying before, much more in Europe before even concluding the conquest of Anatolia. It was fragmented into these various emirates that were, like that since centuries, and that kept up this kind of continuous warfare among each other, so with these bands of Turkmens. So when these troops are settled on a frontier, there is the problem of sedentarization. So these troops, even if they have this evident semi-nomadic origins, start settling down fundamentally, and they are given a land, right? It initially begins usually with with some tax exemptions, meaning you have to perform this military service, so we exempt you at least from taxes. There was all a culture beyond this, and so the sort of privilege, right? There was also all one with religion, meaning that all of this military context was naturally fueled with this Islamic vision of the Holy War and all this stuff. So there were several privileges attached normally to being a soldier. Look at the Janissaries that were kind of the adoptive sons of the Sultan, even, but they were still slaves, however. Here the thing was much more shaded, but over time, these troops start to settle down, and they usually do it under the control, under the guidance, the leadership of their own older commanders, or what they were, at least by the officers they were usually commanded by. So there is something similar to the feudal system that the Ottoman Empire is the Timar. Right, the Timar is basically this fief that, so it was land granted by the Ottoman sultans in this period that had an annual tax revenue not less than 20,000 axes. Right, it was not a few. So naturally, on the base of this land, just like in feudalism, properly, with the exception that the Ottoman Empire, like it was in the case of the Byzantine Empire, that was a much more direct control of the state in these lands. In fact, the Timars was, at least initially was not hereditary, but you have to perform military service, right? And it's interesting because part of this Turkmens, this Akinci, and I say Turkmens at this point, but they weren't quite all Turkmens anymore. They were joining, like, from all the various even surrounding populations, right, for the sake of receiving land and performing this military service in exchange. In Mialovich's memoir, there is the explicit mention that these troops still depended on horse breeding for their livelihood. So we're relatively early in time, but it shows in here that as many elements of the Ottoman army, there was still this continuity with the ancient kind of ethnic tradition. This is very important because even considering Ottoman military culture, you have to realize that the Ottomans were incredibly modern, right? They were really on vanguard with, for example, firepower. They had this very different mindset from all the, let's say, the other Islamic powers, at least most of them. They were much more Western and modern in their orientation, but still they knew how to use the very best of this ethnic background, right, without making it dine out. Now, I'm no expert on the various, let's say, social and economical changes that occurred on this frontier. Maybe I will prepare talks about that on another occasion with a bit more of material. But it seems to me that, however, the Ottoman military didn't quite manage with this the Akincis in general or didn't even have the need actually at that point to make them become something more, right? They remained with this kind of character for a long time. They didn't quite evolve into some sort of heavier or more professional kind of troops. Maybe more professional a little bit, but still they remained largely light cavalry, even though their equipment progressively weakened over time. All right, this is also important to represent, but it's obvious that for light cavalry, mostly you need these troops to do mostly that, and you always let's say you can always count on them in large numbers. These troops, as we will see later, were very important in the battlefield because usually they had this screening task in front of the Ottoman army. They were literally a lot, and that had to harass the enemy before the heavier troops in the posterior ranks would attack. So it was very functional to the Ottoman tactics in the first place to have such troops. there was, however, a bit of economical dynamicization, let's say, excuse me, of these troops, especially when they began to settle down, because many of them began to rent their own horses, right? It often happens, like in all military history, that there are certain troops that are that have to perform a certain military service, but they kind of settle down. They stop being hungry, and therefore what they do is that they have some wealth, in this case this cattle, and they start renting it to someone else for performing the same military service, right? So sometimes, they would, send these horses to foray, or lend these horses to others for half of the booty, right? Because at the end of the day, these troops, since the beginning, were usually paid with loot, right? That's what light cavalry does. Most of light cavalries in every army at this time, even in Western Europe, were, say, largely irregulars. Think about the Stratiots of the Venetians, that incidentally came largely from the Balkans, where such cavalries were basically all over. So there are this kind of small, even business that form in this pretty troubled frontier, right? There is also the Italian Giovan Maria Angiolello, who was actually Mehmed's the second treasurer, who accompanied the Sultan in his campaign against the White Ship Turks in 1473. We will talk about the White Ship Turks later, because they were part of these auxiliary troops in turn. And Angiolello writes that the Akinci, he actually writes Aganzi if I'm not wrong, are not paid. They're not paid except by the booty which they may gain in guerrilla warfare, right? So this tells you much. Obviously, here we are kind of at an early date, so I doubt that this was the same identical thing like in the mid-17th century. Obviously, it was probably more regular forms of payment, even beyond the granting of land, right? And what is interesting is these lighter troops they were effectively irregulars because they weren't parts of the Ottoman army proper, right? They didn't encamp, for example, with the rest of the army. They were all around. They lived out there on their own. These guys were perfectly habituated to live out there in the wild. So their task was really to gravitate around the army and to do all what was necessary at that point to pave its path, like traversing, pillaging, and vasting the enemy's country on every side, right? And this is important because these troops, in spite of being so light and not really framed under much of a centralized direction, they were terribly efficient. At least some say disciplined, right? But I don't think it was literally discipline. I mean, it was probably a lot of military experience and naturally brought to the idea that they had to be disciplined within each other, obviously, and sticking together. Also because their task was pretty damn dangerous, right? So if you don't do that, you die. But it was really the relative simplicity of their task, right? This kind of operations require definitely great intelligence, great skill, but they're essentially simple, right? They don't require an enormous collective training. You just go out there and you raid and you pillage, right? They were definitely able to move all around, but the important thing was to make them penetrate basically all around and to lay waste the enemy's lands. And as we were saying before, they would be rewarded with loot that sometimes wasn't even they took it directly from the enemy. Like it was the idea, and it's that there was no intermediate in this sense. Obviously, maybe within them there was some sort of regulation on how to share it, but to divide it. But in general, you can't count on these troops because you know that you give them free hand to do what the hell they like, because that's what they have to do, right? It's a very destructive task. And in this occasion that Angelello describes, says that, however, can be some sort of exaggeration, but not excessively, says that these troops were well mounted. It counted up to 30,000 men, right? Now, 30,000 men, it's actually a lot, right? But it really tells you, in general, that these troops were really many, right? The number makes strength of these troops, because a body on battlefield, they're not a big deal. Like, they can harass the enemy, you can't pursue them. In this sense, are very, very annoying, and they bite, right? Because they're like mosquitoes. They hit from every side. They're difficult to kill individually, right? But overall, they can't withstand the offensive of heavier troops, or at least they can lure them. They can make a scorched hand strategy, but you can't besiege a city like that. You can't defeat, without the help of heavier troops, enemy armies like that, especially Western armies. They were very, very different. These maybe were good against other Eastern populations that fought with horse archery like them, but not with the Westerners. And these troops were all about naturally horsemanship. Mihailovich tells us that each Akinci served with 2 good horses, meaning that this was normal at the time, like in every military context. It's very rare, even for light cavalry, not to have a spare horse with you. Obviously, they could have more, also depending on what they had to do, but usually they had 2, which for light cavalry is kind of good, also because they have to carry the loot, right? This is very important. So these troops weren't terribly wealthy, right? Because the cavalry with more horses is usually the heavy cavalry, right? It's like the lance, the idea that there is a heavily armored guy, and then a valet, a squire, and other spare horses. So that's the big thing. This needed 2, one for them and one for loot, right? And naturally also for if you don't carry the loot, but if your horse gets killed, you mount on the other one, hopefully, and then you can run away. As we were saying before, these troops had a pretty standard equipment, basically lance, bow, and saber. These were pretty standard weapons throughout all over semi-nomadic cavalries, right? They had even lazos and stuff like that. They had throwing. Those were missile troops largely, and then they had sabers. They're pretty damn good swords on horseback, but they're just for butchering down hopefully an enemy that is running away. Really not. These troops are not, on average, by the way, because this is also important to stress, heavily equipped. On average. Also in here we will learn afterwards, there was a kind of certification even within the same Akincis. Like, they weren't literally all light cavalry, and there was a tiny bulk of them that was kind of heavier, right? So the Akinci were framed under well, first of all, these troops, like it was in the Turkish-Mongolian tradition, they moved in swarms of 10. That was the most elementary unit. It was all a decimal system, basically. And they were framed under officers called Toviyeler. I hope I pronounced it correctly. That was the guy who received fiefs, right? That is to say, this kind of more NCOs than officers, actually, at this level, received land in order to organize these other troops. So this already tells you that the large part of these troops were kind of socio-economically depending on someone else, right? At least at the beginning. the higher commanders, like officers of the Akinci, that was essentially to lead a raid, was in the hands of the Sansak Bey. From whose province the Akincis were raised and foray launched, right? So this is important because these were troops that, from Constantinople, from Istanbul, that could be called, like, raid in that direction. Okay, I'll do. The provincial government would launch these things, counting on these local NCOs that he had scattered around the territory. And in fact, these leaders were on that occasion called Akinci Bey, right? So probably the chieftains of the Akinci, so the chieftain of the raiders, properly. Then, so as we've seen, these Akincis depended on the frontier on this hereditary Uts Beys, right, or frontier governors, right, and the Akincis represented, in many ways, because there were many, a counterweight to the Turkish nobility proper that controlled most the Sipais instead, right? So this was an amount of troops that, with their number, managed to counterweight the ambitions of the landed Turkish, can't call it big word like gentry, but it's, they had more lands, that were individually more powerful, and in fact kind of heavier troops on the battlefield at an individual level, right? And the Beys, as we've seen, were paid, right? While the rest of their troops mostly were rewarded with and had to live with and by plunder. There were really a few Ottoman frontiers that were regularly garrisoned during the 16th century, right? The only exception at this point was the reorganized Hungarian mark that had this specificity, which after 1533 had certain Timar fiefs that maintained Akincis proper. So that's where the northwesternmost avampost was so important, with frontier with eventually the Habsburgs, etc. But had to be needed a bit more robust administration and rewarding system for these troops to make them efficient. Now, there were, for example, during there were other troops here that maybe I don't know where to talk about it. Yes, during the 16th century, there were even certain Christians that naturally participated to the Ottoman army. Christian Serbia, for example, provided auxiliary horsemen as well as Sipais proper and vassals to the empire. While many early 16th century Balkan Akincis were new converts, probably from old Christian Sipai families. Right. So you understand that here there's this attractiveness of the military service in these Ottoman controlled territories that were Christian, but they fought equally for this new power. So the Akincis had kind of a swinging history. In 1595, a series of defeats brought to the official disbanding of the Akincis. There were other troops that remained, that we'll see later, the Delis, for example, that we will explain now in a while. But first of all, I wanted to talk about the Janzaban. I think they're called. It was another type of cavalry that seems to mean literally as a name, the daredevils. This was created very early at the time of Orkhan in around 1441, or by Murad II, to counter the first Balkan expedition of Janos Hunyadi. These troops were kind of seemingly, we don't really know much about them. It seems they were either kind of picked Akinci troops, right? Because they're, or maybe they had a different extraction, because they usually served in the vanguard of the Ottoman army and therefore were probably drawn from this multitude of lighter troops. Some scholars instead believed that these were probably the bodyguards of the Sanzak Beys or the Bey Beys. That is maybe an option that we don't. I'm not really sure whether to agree or not, because one thing is, in the big combat, of course, maybe a bodyguard is not really the best option to send in the front line. What for at the end of the day? Definitely, there were troops that kind of served in. They need to serve in the front, but the bodyguard is fundamentally something you want to preserve. That is meant to be even a kind of elite, right? So it's obvious that the Akinci would have kind of spearhead units on their own. When you have this large amount of troops in the range of thousands for every army, well, they can't be all literally the same thing. Especially if they move and they have their autonomous organization and tactical attitude, let's say, that they will probably develop this kind of internal segmentation. And that's where we talk about the delis. So the name appears seemingly into it could be a corruption of the term delil, which means guide. Some other call them like the madmen. This idea of kind of forlorn hope troops that were sent, like picked units, etc. And so here it shows you how blurred sometimes our knowledge is about them. It's a term that appears since the 15th century, and it seems that most of these delis were actually recent converts from countries like Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia. All right, delis were recorded elsewhere in other regions in other areas of Rumelia and Anatolia during the 16th century. But they also appeared, and only just once in Syria, in the 17th century, and at this time they included Turks and Kurds. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that over time, naturally, the Ottoman Empire had formed these units that had original, even ethnical peculiar names that had been formed from local languages, but they were replicated as model of troops elsewhere, so people of other ethnicity would join them, and so that this corps would kind of sound the same. So you see that this choice of having kind of converts or people even of another faith as bodyguards is really constant in military history, because the idea is that there can be some kind of animosity at the religious level, but most of the times it's really about money, and therefore it's better to have someone who kind of depends on you, because as recently converted has maybe already entered your milieu, your protection. So is a person who is a sort of outcast if it didn't have your own protection, and therefore is faithful to you more than an average Muslim would be, for example, because maybe that Muslim has already his own privileges, his own property, his own interests, and other clientele. So that not just in the Ottoman Empire, but also in other Muslim powers, there was this tendency of using the idea of the slave soldier. Think about the Janissaries in the first place, but the Mamluks in general. And the concept is really the same. And naturally over here, and over time, this system would be absorbed, right? When you have hundreds of years of domination, these areas do not need anymore to take the Ottoman devshirme. Like this at the beginning was literally the Ottomans raiding these Balkanic communities and taking away children from their families and slaughtering even them, and stuff. After 2 centuries, like, it was literally these populations that wanted to join, to send their children to become janissaries, because they knew what kind of privileges at that point they would assume, so that they could make their fortune and their wealth. So there is always a big transformation here. It's never, a static thing. And as we've seen with this example, it was not even always a kind of such a dramatic thing at the end of the day, given that that world was already pretty dramatic by itself. So very important in the Ottoman auxiliary cavalry were these populations that were properly came from outside the Ottoman borders. Chiefly the Tartars. Naturally, the Tartars had it as a national military style, exactly the same one of horse archers, right? The Ottomans had some kind of Freudian relation with the Mongol hordes because, in the Turkic Mongol world, there is this kind of shared models of power. I mean, the Khanate, the Great Khan, and the Turks had, in part, to recognize the greatness of the Mongol tradition. Like, they had respected it also because their culture were pretty damn similar. And also their warfare was basically the same. So the Ottomans always were, in spite of having reached this enormous power, were always traditionally reverent, at least formally speaking, towards at that point the descendants of the Mongol of the Mongol Empire. The Khanate of the Golden Horde, the Crimean Tartars, etc. The Ottomans even conquered the Crimean Tartar Crimea, and they, in fact, there was always in Istanbul a hostage at the Sultan's court from these populations to ensure the alliance of these fellow Muslims, right? And these troops kind of they were also paid from loot. Like there were different ways to hire them, because naturally, one thing was naturally the son of that Khan that was in fact a prince, fundamentally, that if you keep like an hostage to maintain, also to strengthen this faithfulness, this faith towards the Sublime Gate, right? These hostages were theoretically free, right? But they were framed by the Ottomans in their own elite units, picked units, together with the Turkish youth and all this stuff. So the cream of the Ottoman forces, and therefore the idea was to develop this esprit de corps, right? That in spite the families of origin were definitely, tributaries, excuse me, of the empire, and they wouldn't be happy to serve the Ottomans, but still, they showed the Ottomans showed them the benefits that could derive from this cooptation, right? The sons of these foreign princes served in the Müteferrika cavalry in the Ottoman capital, right? It was a regiment which also included the sons of Turkish noblemen, as we were saying, that was in turn a part of the Kapikulu Corps. It was the elite Ottoman cavalry, right? The Müteferrika were also paid, uniformed, and educated by the Ottomans, while at the same time being hostages. So this tells you, and this wasn't just for the Tartars, it was like for all the other, even Christian powers that, was princes were sent to train into Constantinople. And you can imagine all the intrigues and this stuff, but it did work, because it was a way also to make these populations understand what really the empire had become. Other troops, like, I think, bands of Tartar mercenaries were scattered all around the Black Sea, and it wasn't difficult to hire them. But usually they were framed under some lord, some chieftain of sorts, that at that point had to take a political position towards the empire, or pro or against, right? these troops functioned pretty much like the Akincis conceptually on the field, right? The Crimean Khanate was kind of poor at this point, and up to the point that many of its tribesmen had even to fight on foot. There was also probably a consequence of sedentarization. Also consider that Crimea was still plenty of people of other origins. There were Italians, there were Greeks. So this, the way these troops were raised was very, very heterogeneous, as we have seen before. There was a kind of an elite, though, that was composed by full-time warriors, the Oglans, that made up the Khan's guard. So the ultra elite, basically, and then a tribal militia under its own traditional Mirza aristocracy that instead provided if anything, the numerical bulk of the Tartar armies. It's very interesting that in this period, especially towards the end, where firearms were spreading in among these populations, the Crimean Khan also had 20 tiny companies of mounted infantrymen armed with firearms, right? So these were usually raised from farming villages. So obviously these were settled communities, not the usual, the traditional Tartar semi-nomads, right? And they were part of the royal domain. So this was an attempt, even for this kind of small powers, to do something similar to what was happening in Europe with permanent troops, either we're talking from, about the Ottoman Empire, the Christian West. This man, this is particularly interesting because there is the change of a culture over time. Because the Tartars were traditionally adverse to firearms, right? They were so proud about their military traditions that they thought they had conquered the world back in the day with the Mongol Empire, which objectively was true. So this posed a big deal of cultural resistance even to modernization, right? These weren't probably very close-minded peoples, but the point is that they lacked a political, social basis to evolve into something different from their tribal thing. So the fact that there was now the addition of kind of dragoon companies, basically, modeled on what the Westerners were doing, it's in this Crimean context, is pretty damn cool, right? And it was said, however, that there are also certain anachronisms of success, because Tartar bows, in spite of all, were still considered lethal in many ways, and capable of countering even Western tactics. For example, it was believed that Tartar bows could outrange muskets until the 18th century, basically, and they could even hit through cuirasses and mail hauberks. Maybe there's a bit of fantasy around this, because actually cuirasses are meant to stop anything about bows and all. But it's obvious that there can be some effective results you can do, especially considering that at the end of the period, in the mid-17th century, the Europeans are progressively abandoning armor, because the muskets are at this point better. But objectively, some archery traditions still could outrange muskets, so that also posed some sort of problem. In any case, Western, only in certain contexts, right? Normally Western troops that deal with steppes warfare at this point annihilate the steppe troopers, right? They take what the Russians did with Siberia at that point. So, but they still can be useful in some way. After all, even in the 18th century, Europeans were defeated many times around the world by populations that were objectively kind of still primitive in many ways. So it depends on the context, right? Ideally, you have a big edge, and even factually, the Europeans had, but not all the tactical contexts are best, so for the Tartars, I think this was important. Then there were also the black, first the black, but also the white ship Turks, or Ak-Koyunlu as they were called. There was basically a Turkmen and Kurdish confederation that had survived Timur's invasions in eastern Anatolia. It was a bit of a problem for the Ottomans, right? The white ship Turks had firstly overthrown the black sheep ones, the Kara Koyunlu confederation that dwelled in the nearbys, and eventually they fought against the Ottomans themselves, right? At the end of the day, however, they fought between 1499 and 1504 against the Safavid Persians who were on the rise, and they fell to them. So at that point, the Ottomans also took the chance to frame them a little bit in their army, and with the same even hostage means, etc. These Turkmen troops, as we've seen, fought essentially like the other Asian troops of the steppes. Anatolia was a bit of a problem, as we were saying before. In the beginning of the 16th century, if I'm not wrong, it was the Kizilbash revolt. The Red rebellion that shook the Ottoman Empire to its foundation. It was basically led by Anatolian Turkmen that were backed by the Persians against the Ottomans, right? And they were in fact a Shia confession, and just for saying how sometimes this, especially when confederations were united, they could do a big deal. They could also, we've seen that there was there was really no physical frontier. Like a concentrated military power could get through the empire and make a pretty big mess in this sense. The white ship Sultan and his local leaders kept also force of paid trained cavalry, right? So it's the same exact social, political, social, military segmentation that we have seen within the Crimean Tartars. There were these Pushan Push, this is the name, or Pushandar, means armored men. They were the best armed, and they served actually as heavy cavalry, right, with barded horse. They were evidently an elite, both qualitatively and numerically speaking. But naturally, bear in mind that when we talk, that this was heavy cavalry and usually fought as heavy cavalry, but this Asiatic population were always able to resort to archery, right? The bow was really a big symbol into. They were, especially in this eastern Anatolian area, was pretty damn influenced by Persian military art, right? They used lances as well in this feudal tradition, in fact. Then there were the Tirkash band, there were the quiver bearers, literally, they were the mounted archers instead, so the average horse archer that provided the numerical bulk of the army. And also this other kind of servants like the Gulukchi, this I believe it's pronounced. They were sort of mounted retainers. Always bear in mind that wherever there is a heavy cavalry, there is some mounted retainer. That is usually a serf of some kind, as we were seeing before, for example, with the Dalits, right? That maybe were converts, even the Near East, these areas were pretty damn religiously diverse. So sometimes some used shields. I mean, this horse archery tactics and equipment were much different from the one of the previous centuries, right? It was very traditional, very traditional in many ways. There were also armored archers for sure, without lances, albeit naturally unarmored horses are the commonest in even iconography, etc. And there was also, since some centuries, a pretty strong Mongol-style light horse archery involved in here, kind of smaller ponies, basically. Yeah. And other armies included, for example, aside from the saber and the dagger that were pretty much universal, also short axes. And this is important because the axe, as you know, is a blunt weapon, so it's probably means that they were so fanatic in many ways they could even attack armored opponents without being armored themselves. And even in terms of numbers, the white ship Turks were kind of a power on their own. There is a Venetian traveler that states that around 1474 there was a cavalry horses at a review that counted 20,000 horses, 2,000 of which were metal. Had metal armor, which is not bad because it was, pretty good average in general. At least here, maybe some part of armor. Others definitely had leather or kilted armor. Usually, especially in the East, if they had an armor, it was usually lamellar with parts of mail as well. And it seems, in terms of the spread of firearms, the Near East was a bit more dynamic. In fact, it seems that white ship Turks captured in 1472 some Ottoman guns, and it seems that in their armies they even had handgunners, and together with guns in the center of their arrays. So this is important because it shows a bit more of an abandonment of usual traditions for something a bit more evolved, which tells you how this power that's often not mentioned, however, still the potential that it had, at least. Talking about Bulgaria and Albania, these were early vassals of the Ottoman Empire, and they provided effective cavalry. Aside from the Devshirmen and the various, but as local traditions, they provided this kind of troops. There was, as we have said before, some direct rule imposed on Serbia as well, with the Vojnik infantrymen who had to come from every 5 Christian households in the Belgrade region. Serbia was kind of advanced in its own regard in the Balkans for gun manufacture since the late 14th century. So this was made soon available to the Ottomans. In fact, at the Battle of Ankara, which was kind of early in time, 1402, the Serbian infantry, black steel armor, used firearms, while Serbian cavalry fought in a kind of a traditional, with spear and sword. And it's very interesting that there are the Serbian troops clashing as a matter of fact, in the east against the Timurids. In the eastern frontier of the Ottoman Empire at this stage. Right. In the 15th century, Bosnia provided the vassal Lagator cavalry that wore also in here the so-called burume, I believe in Turkish evidently cuirasses, while their squires had male auberks. Now it's very interesting, these Balkanic areas provided substantially armored troops, right? So these were naturally already pretty, intensely westernized countries in military culture. They and they were basically identical in many ways to the Western military in terms of equipment, etc. The Balkans were penetrated usually by Milanese armor exports. You find them up to Romania. It's so the Ottomans seized these assets as well. There's also Hungary, that had a vassal status for almost a generation. Ottoman authorities, sometimes after 1541, even extended over certain Austrian governors. Right, this is kind of how far this power could reach on that frontier. In fact, there was another type of Balkan light cavalry that is found in the retinues of the beys and pashas. They were known as the Beslis, who resembled, and in this sense probably included, Hungarian hussars, that are light cavalry that had been developing, in fact, in Hungary. Just to say that obviously all these local traditions were progressively absorbed into the Ottoman military. Then there are these other countries that are very important in the context. There are Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia, that were the most important Christian vassals of the Ottoman Empire. The Vlach nomads actually fought pretty much everywhere in the Balkans, like against everyone, literally. Even they served the Ottomans, they fought the Ottomans. It was pretty normal, right? You can't see it even in other Balkanic powers. As long as they went around looting, in the case of the Vlachs. Then they also provided other contingents of cavalry and Voynich infantry formations to the empire. The principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia became Ottoman vassals in 1476 and 1504, respectively. But as it's known, they basically remained semi-independent historically. Transylvania was split from Hungary by the Ottomans, in fact, in 1533. So it was this idea of tearing apart the big Hungary by playing these rivalries that existed between the populations that were under the Hungarian monarchy, and at that point, Transylvania had become a semi-detached vassal, and only rejoined in 1629. And so all of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania were employed in Ottoman service, but also within each other, right? These populations had their own nobility. Then that were the boyars, famously speaking. There were landing-owning peasants, were the vitae known, and they basically had been reduced to serfdom almost everywhere, except in Transylvania. Actually, maintained this kind of less social stratification, so that they had kind of more robust communities of peasants. There was also in here the development of regular troops, the Curteni, that served these own countries, and then there were the Haiduks. They were instead military border settlers, and instead then there were other forms of troops that developed further with the spread of firearms, like the Seimeni as mounted harquebusiers, the Dorobanti with Berdish axes, that were famously used in combination with the matchlock musket, etc., as a close quarter weapon. And so the story of these populations is very interesting because they intervene in various, like for example, at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, the Prince Bethlen Gabor of Transylvania intervened on the Protestant side with his own small standing army of mailed lancers, horse archers, and more conventional pikemen and musketeers, and even with peasants that were supplemented, were used to bear firearms, basically. Now, this is very interesting because it shows you that even in Transylvania there were things like horse archers, right? That tells you how Eastern influences from the steppes and partly from the Ottoman Empire was strong. And so these were all troops or countries that developed with a constant, let's say, receiving a constant input from the surrounding military traditions, and that learned, in fact, both directly and indirectly, meaning that they had to fight literally against this from the Ottoman military, right? And all the wars that were being fought on those frontiers, right? There were naturally many other minorities scattered in the Ottoman military, especially if you take the eastern frontier, aside from the ones we have mentioned. There were many Kurds as well, other Turkmen nomads of various other tribes and confederations. What we didn't say, perhaps, is that peoples like the Wallachians and the Moldavians sometimes served the Ottoman military with their own native voivodes and hospodars. This is particularly interesting. The voivode would be basically the equivalent of the count, if I'm not wrong, and the gospodar is a generic kind of lord or master. Sometimes it was the voivode also was called hospodar. So aside from weaponry, or maybe we'll add some other weaponry here, what would an average Ottoman auxiliary cavalryman would like? Well, as an headdress, you could see a hanging cap of snow leopard skin decorated with eagle's wings, and their cloaks also with leopard skin, and they often wore shields that had this kind of odd pattern. It was quadrangular, but with one of the superior angles kind of pointy. These were kind of shields that had been developed really often in previous centuries in this Balkanic area, and had spread all around. And even, in fact, you can see even in use of the Hungarian hussars at this point. So they're small shields that sometimes even have, however, kind of an enveloping form. They have probably this minimal ability of stopping, some more projectile at the top, thanks to that protrusion. And they often these shields even had eagle wings nailed to them. They sometimes this outfit, you'd say, well, is it Turkish? Well, really, I mean, it was something you could find in many populations throughout all Eastern Europe, for example. Even, for example, take the Polish winged hussar with all the eagles, feathers, etc. Well, these were all traditions that had already been there from the steppes in a way or another back in the day, either of Indo-European or Ugro-Finnic or even Turkic tradition. And they were meant naturally to embody. Now we are in the modern age, but always think this wasn't much of a secularized world. I mean, behind this infantries, this cavalries, there was all a myth, a mythological past and meaning, and this idea they were kind of celestial or infernal entities, right? The Polish winged hussar is evidently resembling an angel, but it's something that is also very close to the ancient deities of war of the Indo-European mythologies. So it's all, it comes a bit like difficult to say, well, this belongs especially to this culture, because the steppes had produced kind of similar outlooks in this regard. And these feeders and wings are, you can find them literally everywhere, in the world, with some kind of ancient symbolism, right? But it's obvious that there is the intention of making these troops resembling as divine beings, as something that come from the skies, right, and hit hard. And in this sense, they don't have much to do with the tradition of monotheism, really strictly meant. Like, obviously, yeah, the idea of the angel in the Christian, say, the biblical tradition is there, but it's partly a coincidence, partly not, because objectively also the Judeo-Christian tradition takes a lot from those ancient worlds and then their beliefs regarding to this stuff. But the important is that at the end of the day, especially this Akinci, wouldn't look that different from what you could see from the other side, from the Christian armies, really. Even in terms of equestrian traditions. For example, their saddle cloth was a complete pelt, sometimes a lion's, and their jacket usually had wide breeches, could be either of lion or bear skin, with the fur out to preserve better, to isolate better. They had colorful boots, foot-long spurs. Many of the Akincis also wore maces, and aside from scimitars. So when you see mace, as we were saying before with the Turkmens, axe, you always have to think that means to attack an armored opponent, right? These were pretty damn effective weapons. Even sometimes they could wear kind of swords that looked more like bars, like armor-piercing swords that were slung horizontally beneath the right saddle flap. There is all a fence related to this, because it's on horseback. You can with the forces involved, the speeds and all, you can easily break your wrist or elbow or shoulder by not using these weapons properly. And yet, you understand that they were kind of precision weapons. So these troops were, individually speaking, they were pretty damn well trained, right? And naturally, it was the lance that is the best option in any case. But the lance can break. It has some limits. Some of them could be like small pole axes, like with a pole axe blade below the point. So this kind of military traditions and experiences that were all similar in a certain sense, and that could definitely be assimilated in this century-long Western Ottoman frontier, were definitely blended, and a lot. So today we stop here, because I'm not excessively satisfied with how I made this video, but I think that it gives an idea. Okay, maybe we can talk a bit of other auxiliaries though, because I see here that I had collected other. We didn't say before. For example, what about the Ottoman other frontiers? Today we concentrated a little bit too much on the Western frontier. Well, maybe not so much, but there was also the Arab one. And a very important auxiliary cavalry in the Ottoman forces was the one provided by Arab provinces that naturally fielded Bedouin tribesmen. Right? They were very, very important as a military resource in the deserts east of the Orontes, Litani, and Jordan valleys. Right? that the Ottomans penetrated at this point, they were usually armed with guns, swords, daggers, bows, slings, and sometimes these tribes were difficult to keep to being kept obedient, because Arabia up to obviously the 20th century has always had this problem that there aren't enough resources for living in a different way from the tribal fashion, right? So these peoples, as we know, since take even how Islam spread, had always kind of dwelled at the outskirts, sometimes of very, very developed empires, and the Ottomans were content with these peoples to be relatively quiet, also because they connected. The Ottomans controlled Yathrib at this point, all these places, holy places of Islam in Arabia, so that they cared about maintaining safe routes even for the pilgrims and so on. But sometimes these Arab tribes were so poor that they ended up raiding certain Ottoman lands as well. Some of them were fielded also elsewhere, like in Egypt or Libya or Tunisia, up to at that point even places like Algeria, but at that point they were kind of local Bedouins, right, local nomads, right, and that were basically the same thing. We also didn't talk about the Cossacks, right? We have talked about the Tartars that dwelled in the steppe, but there were these nomadic neighbors and occasionally fellow vassals, the Cossacks, that were an integral part even of the frontier with powers like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And these peoples had interesting tactics aside from the horse archery. They knew how to form these fortresses with two-wheeled carts, so to form the tabors, right? That could be even defended by light artillery and infantry arquebusiers. Always remember that the Don's Cossacks were famous because they were kind of a pirate island on the Don, the Zaporizhia, if I'm not wrong, but I mispronounce it for sure. It's in today's Ukraine. Were people, all the outcasts, criminals, exiles, people gone in ruin from literally all the west of all Europe, the Ottoman Empire would take refuge, right? So they lived of factor raids, of piracy and so on, but they were quite tactically aggressive, right? They sometimes, they were also under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They were pretty efficient in war canoeing, for example, in all these vast Ukrainian rivers and waterways. In fact, their base was protected by marshes, largely, and that's how they had preserved them. And we talked before about the Kurds. Many Kurdish chiefs had, the Kurds, as you know, even in current foreign policy, the Turks and Kurds do not like very much each other. However, back in the day, what happened is that after the Battle of Calderan in 1514, the Ottomans they defeated the Persians massively, so the Kurds at one point were obliged to switch allegiance to the Ottomans because the Turks had become too powerful in the area not to. So, and they were used also on the frontier as tough mountaineers against the Persians. Yeah. And it's interesting because even certain Janissary units were garrisoned in the main Kurdish towns, and in fact the Kurds participated to Ottoman armies often, very often. even in Europe, in 1596, for example, the cavalry from Diyarbakir formed the vanguard of the Ottoman army. So it's in one occasion, at least it was. This gives you the idea of how important and reliable these troops were. And but talking about the Middle East in general, the Kurds are a bit of an exception, meaning that most of the communities down there didn't quite move much from their homes to go serve the empire somewhere else. There were many Maronite Christians and the Druze of Lebanon. Then there were famously the semi-autonomous Mamluks of Egypt that would always maintain their part in fact of their prerogatives in there. They were important also in later and contemporary Ottoman history. There were many other populations, even tribesmen in Iraq, in the Persian, say better in the Arabian Gulf coast and parts of Eritrea as well, where the Ottomans arrived with their sphere of influence. And naturally, very often these communities were reminded that they were under an empire, because they saw Janissary garrisons in there to keep them at bay. And there is also an economical importance that certain regions had for feeding the same Ottoman military. For example, regions like Moldavia, Transylvania, and Wallachia provided wood for the musket stocks, draft horses, saltpeter, tin and rope, while Kurdistan, Iraq, and Lebanon provided the naft, that is the pitch, sulfur, and saltpeter. And these were all essential materials, as you understand, for firearms that for which the Ottomans were kind of famous for in that, especially at the beginning of this period, and that were very valuable assets, but in regions that were somewhat far from the very center of the empire. So this is important to add, in my opinion, because it tells you how the relation between these countries wasn't just about I send you some troops and they fight for me and all. It's a broader connection. It's all one with economy and trade and wealth, right? As we've seen here, there were lots of populations that had been traditionally enemies of the Ottomans that instead start fighting for them, because at that point there wasn't much of an option. But not just because the Ottomans would otherwise retaliate, that was also a thing, but also because they made money with that. It was a profitable business, and the elites especially need always to keep their assets growing, right, and investing in, and these were the big markets, right? So even if these weren't dramatically expansive economies like the Western ones at this time, still, there was a dynamism that reflected also the Ottoman capabilities to serve, to field troops and to maintain them, and upgrading technology that starts becoming very important. So naturally, these are all things that we will explain individually in singularly dedicated videos, but this was just to give an idea, more or less, beyond even the light cavalry in itself, but about how the picture was, and how also varied really the pool of recruitment of the Ottoman army actually was, because that's like, if you want to learn Ottoman history, it's basically all about this, and that's where they took their strength from, largely, and there is in fact this character of the Ottoman Empire that I've tried to emphasize on Schwerpunkt, that is this ability to think beyond the usual traditions. Effectively, the Osmans had developed from just one of the various emirates of a small emirate of the northwestern Anatolia, It wasn't much of different from others, but when these guys find the way to expand, which was a vacuum largely left by the same rivalries among the Westerners, they are able to not to remain traditionalists, like to stick into their ancient models, etc., but they immediately understand the possibilities that they had in terms of centralization, of improvement, of investment, even in new technologies, etc. And they surpass largely many other powers around there. Like we've seen the Ottoman Empire, aside from the European advance, is kind of famous, but they wipe out in one shot, like the Mamluks, that had been the largest power in the Near East and North Africa at that point. And they crashed the Persians in Iraq, and of course the Persians will always fight against the Ottomans, but they keep this frontier with Europe. They extend the Black Sea. I mean, it's a they did something that if they had certain limitations, they would have never been capable to do. They're able to surpass their resistance, their cultural resistance. It wasn't so dramatically fast as some believe. Like, even if you look at the spread of the military customs, even the spread of firearms wasn't so quick, so immediate, right? But by the beginning of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had the most advanced gunpowder technology and artillery technology in general, the whole Europe and Mediterranean, and they maintained it for quite a time. Yeah, famously, even snipers. There is one problem also with this. I'm throwing a lot of stuff in, but there is one dramatic problem. Is that for powers like the Ottoman Empire, but also for Eastern Europe by certain standard, that we don't really know much. Partly because they were kind of a bit different societies. They didn't produce as much as what the West was producing, but also because probably there is much to dig, right? Still, and historiographies take time before taking off, especially from, I don't know, if you were under the Soviet Union, for example. That's not an easy thing to surpass. But or even the Ottoman Empire proper, because even certain things leave a mark. But there is, I was not saying that the Soviet Union and Ottoman Empire were contemporaries, because they were not, but just to make you understand that there are certain countries need to still to develop a lot in terms of historiographical, awareness, because sometimes they are the only ones who can answer that. If anything, there is a linguistical problem. I mean, who does know Turkish today in Europe? Yeah, it's plenty of people who come from Turkey, who live in Europe, even first, second, even third generation at this point. But also here, there is still not a structural thing. I mean, obviously, even in Turkey, they're probably working well for in this direction. They have their own interests, obviously, in doing so. Just for saying that the future still holds a lot of answers, a lot of questions to be answered, and it's very important even for the West proper, because we need to understand what the other side was like, in order even to understand ourselves. I mean, these are kind of very, very interesting perspectives that I'm personally not very much into, because I have completely different fields and let's say of studying. Let's put it in this way. But I mean, it's fascinating. I hope you get why. It's the Ottoman Empire has been something big, and as Europeans, it's important to learn about it, because it can tell you so much about how we were defined by that historical phase. And it doesn't matter where you were, within the Ottoman Empire, your countries within the Ottoman Empire, it's in Western Europe. It's still important to concentrate on the how these two areas were defined in relation with each other, right? And there were so many intersections. Never forget it. And think about even the various political, think about France, that was constantly kind of allied with the Ottoman Empire just to knock out the Habsburgs, right? And yeah, so many stories that I want to start talking about. I think I will add soon, if everything goes well, which in my life I really don't know. But something more about, in fact, the Turkish wars, right? And between things like the siege of Vienna and Malta and all this stuff. Those are very interesting things. However, for now, let's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.